Hi guys, and welcome to another tutorial. Today's pretty exciting because we're actually going to be getting into database access. So for those of you who are totally uninitiated to databases, I'm going to do some explanation. But first, let's revisit our factory class. Now, what we did last time was we did produces, calculator, build instance, and we just did new calculator, and we passed in a boolean as to whether or not the request should be logged. Now we're actually going to extend this a little bit. So we're going to create, first let's create the class that's going to be stored in the database. And this is one of the most wonderful parts of Enterprise Java. All you have to do is make a class, throw a couple of annotations on it, and you have got a database. It's pretty cool. So we're going to call this one expression. And what we're going to be doing with this class is we're going to be keeping track of every time this endpoint gets called. So we're actually going to keep track of it. We're going to say, hey, we got hit at this endpoint, and we're logging the expression that was sent to us. So in order to do that, I'm going to just put one attribute in it, which is a string, which is the expression. Now I'm going to flip over to Google Sheets here for a minute, because basically a database looks a lot like a spreadsheet. And so there's this concept of tables. Now, if you have database experience, you'll know that I'm simplifying some of this a little bit. And I'm only talking about relational databases. We're not going to talk about graph databases or NoSQL, other types of NoSQL databases like document databases and key value stores and things like that. Those are a different topic. And you can still actually use these methods to access those types of databases, but we're going to start with relational databases because this is really simple, really easy to set up, and the same concepts are going to apply. So with all that being said, I'm going to create a column here, which is the expression. And then databases need something besides just the expression in order to differentiate instances of a class. And they need an ID column. And then what a database does is it will generate a unique ID. So it might start with 0 and then 1 and then 2 to start its IDs, and then you get your expressions over here, and we get like some multiplication operations and maybe some division operations. So we get all these expressions that are being processed over here, and then we get like a unique ID. And let's just say, for the sake of this bit, it's just going to increment by 1 every time it inserts the ID. So we're going to make sure it's always on top. So in order to actually make this type of database a reality, we need to add a primary key. And I like to use a long of the object type. So my Vim plugin is so, and we're going to import this annotation ID, which is javax.persistence.id. And then, since we don't want to actually generate the ID ourselves, we're going to do @generated value. And again, this is going to be javax.persistence. And you can read the Java doc if you get real interested, but it basically just says that it tells it that it should generate the key for us. So we have our primary key, which is our unique identifier for this class instance, and then we have the actual expression. And in order to tell Enterprise Java that this is supposed to be used on a database, we're going to add an annotation, and that's not expression, entity. And you'll notice it's also in the javax.persistence package. So all of these annotations and all of these things are part of a specification called JPA, which is the Java Persistence API. And So now that you're starting to get a little more comfortable with JavaEE, you've been using JakartaEE, and you've been using CDI, which is how we do injection. And but JavaEE is actually a wide collection of standards. So it encompasses just all kinds of different stuff. And sometimes there are even multiple standards for each thing. And that sounds a little confusing at first, but there's a reason that different standards exist, and they accomplish different tasks. And they're just designed for different things. And it's really nice to be able to just pick and choose standards that you can find different implementations of. So we're going to get into some of that later, but this is sort of a primer. So I'm going to create some getters and setters, and I'm going to generate all getters and setters for all the fields. And let's create an empty constructor, which we need an empty constructor. And let's create a constructor for our convenience that utilizes the expression, so we can create an instance that has its expression set. So what this is doing, this code right here generates this. So it actually creates a table, which is equivalent in Excel to a sheet, and then it creates the ID column, which is the primary key, and this is anything that's annotated with @ID becomes a special column that's known in MySQL and MariaDB and all of these other ones as the primary key. And you'll see the term primary key if you start Googling things about databases. That's like a special thing. And then expression is our actual data. So this is a view of what the class looks like, and then this is a view of what's actually in the database. So as you can see, each row of this sheet becomes an instance of the class. There's an equivalency there. So when I store this data, if I make an instance of expression, it's going to get stored as a row. And if I pull an expression out of the database, it's going to grab an entire row, and it's going to instantiate an expression class instance. So with all that kind of basic stuff about databases aside, let's go back to the calculator factory. Now, in order to actually use this class and access it in the database, we need to add something called a data access object, or a DAO as it's commonly referred to. So I'm going to create a new class called expression DAO. And this class is going to actually use a few things that we haven't talked about yet. So I briefly mentioned that this @produces and this @inject are CDI, or making use of CDI, which is context and dependency injection. And this is going to use something that's actually a little bit older, called EJB. So that stands for Enterprise Java Bean. And the reason that we have to use EJB for this is because you can't set up database access within a class that is managed by CDI. So in other words, if we create an instance of the class using CDI, we can't use it. We can't use it for database access. So that's why we have to create a class that's an EJB, because EJBs are able to do database access. Now, it does get more complicated than that, because if you want to set up database access within a class managed by CDI, you still can, but that's a little bit out of scope, and that goes a little too deep in the weeds for what we're trying to cover here, because right now I want to get you guys up and running with a basic application that demonstrates database access in a REST API so that you guys can start hacking your own projects. So I'm going to put an annotation on this data access object EJB called stateless. And you're going to notice there was only one import that it found. which was javax.ejb, enterprise java bean.stateless. And I'm going to add yet another annotation that we haven't talked about, persistence context. Now you'll notice there's actually two. There's persistence context singular and persistence contexts plural, and we want the singular form. And then we're going to be injecting something called entity manager. Now you'll notice we're actually injecting an interface here. So this is where Enterprise Java gets pretty darn cool. We may never know what type of entity manager we're getting. We may never see the factory class that produces this, but we know that whatever class it gives us implements the entity manager interface. So we can interact with it as if it is an instance of an entity manager, as if that was a class. So just put that in there. And then we're just going to put a method called persist. You could really call this anything you want. You could call it persist or save to database. I'm just gonna call it save to DB since that was the last thing I said. And then we're gonna take an instance of expression, and we're going to save it into the database. In fact, actually, let's just do something a little more convenient, since we don't want to interact with the expression class directly in our calculator API. We want to interact with all that stuff here. So let's do save to database expression, and then we're going to do string expression, so that way we can save it. And we're going to do em.persist, and this is make an instance managed and persistent. We'll talk about what the idea of being a managed instance means, but don't worry about that for now. Just worry about the fact this word here, persistent, which is saying it's going to actually put it in the database. And instead of saving the string, we're going to save a new expression, and we're going to pass it that expression. So what this is actually going to do is we just call this public method in order to save whatever the expression that was sent to us into the database. Pretty cool, right? Now, our expression DAO is done, and what we're going to do in our calculator factory, actually, let's first flip over to this, and besides should log, so instead of doing a system.out.println, we want to use should log expression DAO dot save to DB expression, and then our constructor should accept an instance of an expression, or sorry, an expression DAO. And I'm going to create a field, and it doesn't need to be final. Okay, so there we go, calculator factory. Now this is gonna show us a little error here. So what we're gonna do, and this is where we get into a little bit more advanced uses of producers, we can actually inject into our producer. So as I mentioned before, we don't have any way of getting access to the implementation of Entity Manager. Now, yes, you can get access to the implementation, but what we're talking about today is the most basic way of using this, in which we don't have direct access. So we don't have access to this. We don't know. We can't do, like, if we try to do new Entity Manager, it says, oh, you want to implement the class? And I'm like, look at all those methods. No, thank you. I don't want to implement that class. That's huge. So I'm gonna just undo that. And we just want to get the instance. We don't want to have to think about how we set it up. So what we're going to do is we're going to put inject on this method, and then we're going to put expression DAO just like this. So now what it does is it sets up, I don't know why it's still showing the red. So this is actually not an error. And maybe I'll just do, sometimes it doesn't like this. Anyway, yeah, sorry. So I think I just did something weird that was not totally spec compliant, and it caught me. So I'm going to inject this field into this class, because it actually creates an instance per request, and then we can pass the instance of exp-DAO into the calculator when we produce it. And since this has an empty constructor, the container that we're running this in will actually be able to produce this class for us, and it will know which type of entity manager to give us, and it'll give us an entity manager that actually has a connection to the database. So let's just call it for now, and we're going to do this in 2 parts because this is getting kind of long, and I want to give you a little bit of time to absorb this, because this stuff it's just hard to get into without moving too fast. So thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you next time.